Hello, this is David Bernstein. I'm founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, and this is the Jewish Contrarians podcast. And I'm here, as usual, with my partner in thought crime, Brandy Shufutinsky. Hello, Brandy.
Hi, David.
All right. So we had a change in plans. We were going to talk to our friend Ben Friedman about his recent article in the Jerusalem Post regarding legacy Jewish organizations and his perceived failure at their leadership during these trying times. Ben couldn't join us this time. We're going to have him on soon. So what we decided to do is pivot and to talk about an article that came out in the New York Times Magazine. I think it was today or yesterday, on Black Jewish relations. It's Black and Jewish activists have allied for decades. What now? Now, this article featured a young woman named Eva Borgwart, and I thought it was just ghastly. I mean, just ghastly. What it did, Eva Bogart is this young, if not now, matters activist from St. Louis, Missouri. She came of age during the Ferguson protests and was very active in those, and discovered during that time the solidarity between the Black BLM cause at Ferguson and the Palestinian cause, and became an activist, a pro-Palestinian activist, and also really a denier of Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. So she became an extremist on that. And the article focused on that whole far left-wing Jewish camp and also the far left-wing BLM camp, and treated those two camps as if they're somehow representative of the modern Black Jewish alliance. Now, I did think that the article did justice to the history of Black Jewish relations. I thought it had quite a nice summary of that, but it didn't take long, or actually it didn't even start that way. It started with this profile of Emily, and then how they were encountering each other at the various protest movements and the like. And at one point in the article, the author of the article, Daniel, I can't remember his last name. Not Daniel, our own Daniel Newman, a different Daniel, said he was surprised that there weren't more Black activists at the pro-Palestinian events in Washington. And he said, well, and Daniel Bergner, thank you, Dan. And the excuse was, well, they've got too much going on. They don't have time for this. They're so busy with their own oppression that they can't really eke out the time to be part of this. So we should understand that. But it was just a weird portrayal of a interesting and complex topic that, and it only portrayed this narrative of the far left wing activists both. Now, they could have easily brought in sort of the more modern versions of the civil rights movement, the NAACP, and the various modern day civil rights organizations, the Urban League, and then the organizations that have been engaging from the mainstream Jewish community. They could have done that. They could have also looked at people like us who are trying to forge new pathways for Black Jewish relations, a new paradigm, one not based on the old civil rights paradigm. And yet, of course, they didn't do that. And they just presented this very, very simplistic, flat narrative about what the Black Jewish relations could be or was going to become, portraying a very small percentage of both communities. Dan, would you bring up this chart that I shared earlier with you? So I shared with Dan a chart that said, share who say they think that the Supreme Court affirmative action ban is good by race and ethnicity. So overall population, 68% of Americans agreed with the Supreme Court ban on affirmative action. 72% were white, 68% were Hispanic. So Hispanics basically tracked with the rest of the population. 63% were Asian, and 52% were Black. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that I think that if you had asked Jews, it would have been less than 52%. So I think more Black Americans, in my theory, support the Supreme Court decision. A majority of Black Americans support the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action. And I think more so than there would have been Jews. That's my guess. Okay, Dan, you can take it down. And I'm saying this not because I'm trying to endorse a particular view on affirmative action, but rather to point out the incredible diversity that exists within the Black community, within every community, within the Hispanic community, which is also portrayed as somehow this ideological BIPOC community that is being oppressed by the American society. We are not monolithic. None of our communities are monolithic. And Brandy will talk more about this. I am positive. And so why do we continually portray the Black community as either the more extreme wing of BLM, as if that's somehow representative, or the more moderate civil rights wing that is sort of maybe, in my view, gravitated more toward the extreme wing and like the NAACP? And we don't talk about like the Black church-going community, which has a totally different political sensibility, which is mentioned in passing in that article, that it tends to be much more sympathetic toward Israel. So I think that they get it wrong. And I think that the mainstream Jewish community, by the way, frankly, gets it wrong too, that they're stuck. And this is, I'm going to end here in a second, Brandy, that they're stuck in an outdated paradigm of Black Jewish relations, thinking that we have to be we have to be joined at the hip between the sort of legacy Jewish organizations and the legacy Black civil rights organizations, that's the only alternative. And so if we take a different view, let's say on diversity, equity, and inclusion, or left-wing ideology, and that's alienating to those mainstream Jewish groups, we will suffer incalculable losses among the mainstream organizations. And I think that really does a disservice to the many Black organizations and leaders who would go along with us on that journey, who don't like that ideology, who want to take a different approach to these issues more generally, and would work with the Jewish community in a very different way than we have in the past. So that's my rant. And Brandy, what say you?
That I'm going to go on my own and follow the advice of the late American icon John Lewis and maybe get into a little bit of good trouble. All right. I think that we've seen extremists co-opt the Black American narrative for the way that they want to portray it for their own gain. And we have focused a lot in American society on what that looks like coming from extremists on the right. And I think this article did a great job of portraying what happens to the Black narrative from extremists on the left, where there's this tokenizing of Black identity and the quote unquote Black struggle, and trying to make it fit the extreme left's political ideology, as far as aligning it with, what was the byline to that article about what it has to do with the so-called Palestinian struggle. And in doing that, there is an immense amount of tokenizing, but also of denigrating the experiences of Black people in the United States of America. The idea that any other people's experiences can be compared to to another people's experiences is disrespectful. To pretend that anything that Palestinians go through or are experiencing is remotely comparable to anything that Black Americans have experienced is disrespectful to the memory of our forebears. And it's interesting to see people who call themselves liberal or progressive engaging in that type of bigotry. The idea that a group of people who has seen trillions of dollars in international aid and squandered every last cent of it, trillions of dollars in international aid that has been paid for by Black Americans through our taxes, to try to compare that to what's the experiences, good and bad, of Black people over here, it's disrespectful. And I take issue with it. And then to try to portray that as some sort of starting point for Black-Jewish relations here, it's disgusting.
Yeah, I like that starting point for Black-Jewish relations. That's not the model that we are looking at, for sure. In fact, the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values very early on had a forum called New Paradigms in Black Jewish Relations, featuring our very own Brandy Shifutinsky, among others. And I thought it was a very rich discussion. And we were saying, well, maybe some of the old civil rights baggage, and in some ways it's not the old civil rights baggage. So just I'll put a placeholder on that for a second. Needs to be revisited and rethought. And then you had this amazing forum where you brought some Black Jews on to talk about their disparate experiences, which didn't adhere to sort of the woke narrative that, you know, that, oh, we're all oppressed, or we're even oppressed as Black Jews. It was much more nuanced and thoughtful and varied than that. And I think that's got to be a roadmap for future Black-Jewish relations. Now, I put a placeholder on the civil rights movement because sometimes I think Jews, American Jews who felt very wed to the vision of civil rights for good reason that Martin Luther King and John Lewis and others brought forth, and feel a sense of kinship to it. And so when they hear that there's a modern version of the civil rights movement, they feel a sense of obligation to engage it in the same manner that a Heschel or Prince did during the early 1960s. But actually, the civil rights movement was in the late 60s wasn't the same as the early 60s. It evolved. It incorporated the Black Power movement, and then later on, radical voices, which you could say are not really part of the civil rights movement, but they spoke in the name of the civil rights movement. And I think a lot of American Jews don't realize that what we're talking about today is not the same civil rights movement of 1960s. I mean, you know, Martin Luther King spoke unabashedly about ultimately trying to reach a colorblind society. Now, colorblindness could get you in trouble nowadays. It could be viewed as a microaggression on many campuses around the United States. So to think that that's somehow that that the people who are engaging in the name of civil rights today are automatically, some might be, but automatically doing so in the legacy of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., I think is just absurd. And that we have to be open to the possibility that some of the people that are doing civil rights today, maybe doing it through a very different paradigm than was done in the late 1960s, and that maybe we're at a different time and place, and we need to start reimagining what Black-Jewish relations can be like. What do you think?
I think any relationship has to start with commonality, common values, common goals. And I think that if they're, and you know, some of those do have to be compromised, but not compromised to the extent that you're giving up your position of identity, of value, giving up your worth in order to say you have an ally that comes from any different community than your own. And I think that's, I mean, I don't know, that article was horrendous. I was outraged reading it. I think that it portrayed something that isn't representative, and I hope never becomes representative, because if it does, we're in trouble, more trouble, I think, than we're already seeing. But the idea that it didn't speak to common goals and common values outside of kind of the outrage industry, which I don't think is again a productive starting point.
Yeah. So what do you think the common values should be in a new paradigm of Black-Jewish relations? What is that new paradigm, or old paradigm? Maybe, I don't know.
Hopefully it's not leaning into stereotypes. Hopefully it's actually challenging them. I think the idea that you know, again, one of the ideas that came out of that article was that an extreme point of view is representative of the Black American community or the Black American narrative. I think that there needs to be pushback against that idea. And then also looking at, you know, ultimately, what's the goal? You know, for what purposes are these relationships being built? If they're just being built to say, hey, I have a Jewish friend, or hey, I have a Black friend, that's probably not the most sincere foundation to build a relationship upon. And then also, you know, there are a lot of many forums that talk about the Black-Jewish relationship, you know, the relationships between these two communities. And most of them do not actually include the multiple voices and multiple viewpoints of Black Jews.
Right. I think that's interesting. And I think also perhaps there's a coalition to be built around liberal values, around preserving our democratic tradition, understanding that that's the tradition that's most likely to produce long-term justice in a society. So why would we turn our backs on it? I mean, King spoke eloquently about these freedoms and why they were they were key to the extrication of the Black community from bondage, why we needed to take what was best in America in order to defeat what was worse in America. And I think that we've got to go back to some of those key democratic liberal values and build a new American center. And it might be a little different for different groups. As you said, we don't have to all be in lockstep. I mean, not all Jews are going to be in lockstep. Here we are in our little contrarian podcast. We're not in lockstep, but we have a common language on which to imagine what America could be, and to sort of build it on I think a narrative that America is an imperfect country trying to live up to its own high ideals and sometimes failing to do that. And so how do we help it live up to its own high ideals? Imagine that, contrast that for a second with sort of the white supremacy narrative, which is America is a pervasively and permanently racist society that irredeemable in that way. And that what we have to actually do is just only shuffle the power deck over time. I think that in a way that would actually destroy what's good about America. And I think that's where we've gotten away from what the historic relationship was all about. And we can return to the old relationship, to the old paradigm, but also understand that we're in a different era now, and it needs to be brushed off and based on some of the challenges that we're living with today.
No, I think that's fair and true. And I think in doing that, there has to be accurate knowledge about our history, in the history of the United States, warts and all. And I think that right now, that's being ignored, where we look at one of the reasons why the civil rights movement was successful is because of the foundation of the United States offered the space to have civil rights. All men are created equal, and men meaning humans, not males. And then looking at the idea of what does it mean to open up opportunity for everybody who's here to achieve and make sure that they have access to the tools needed to achieve. There's that version of making this imperfect nation a little bit more perfect with each generation. And then there's the idea that, well, everything about the United States has always been and always will be bad, so we're going to tear it down. And my question usually starts with, okay, and what's going to replace it?
Right.
And so far, I mean, I haven't gotten an answer to that question, let alone an answer that I would want to say, yeah, let's do that because I want to live in that type of society.
Yeah, very often if they actually do deign to describe this America, it will be so ridiculously utopian that it's not going to go well.
Yeah, it's some Garden of Eden, and it's like, okay, this is somebody's like fantasy. There's no point to entertain it to me because it crosses over to the point of silliness.
Right. Exactly. And we can't build a relationship on that. It actually was in the article. One of the characters in that New York Times article was a woman talking about what could happen in a future Palestine, some kind of one state solution. And she says she's very skeptical of people who say that it won't work. And I'm very skeptical of people who pretend that you can take these two people with their very disparate experiences, disparate cultures, disparate political ideologies, and have them join in a perfect union in from the river to the sea. And we there was a reason why in 1947, UNSCOP, the UN Commission, voted to support a two-state solution and not a one-state solution. There was a minority report, by the way, because there was some minority people who wanted that utopian vision, but they understood that you had Hajj al-Amin Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem, who was not going to live side by side with the Jews in a peaceful coexistence. And so I think it is incumbent upon whatever paradigm we move into on Black-Jewish relations, not the one in the New York Times piece, not necessarily the one that the legacy organizations have been doing all these years, but to fashion one that's actually based on a kind of political realism that allows us to sort of figure out where to go from here in America.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the starting points again is actually having the conversations like we did in the new paradigm, the new paradigms discussion, to have ideas, to brainstorm, to hear what people think, what people's experiences have been. I think that's a starting point. and that starting point actually involves the two communities that you're talking about, not bringing in third or fourth parties, which is what the article did. I don't understand. I don't know. That's kind of where I sit. The other idea is really to think about what type of community and society we're actually trying to build and that we want to live in. And I think that people that talk about what you mentioned, the kind of the one state solution, ignore multiple things besides people's differences in their culture, but the differences in what type of laws they want to live under. And I liken it to, well, we could have also just had one confederacy instead of the United States of America. And I don't really think that things aren't going to look quite equal for people under that type of system, just like they wouldn't look equal under a system that governs by Sharia law or governs like other states did, where there's second-class citizenship and Jews and Christians were treated as dhimmis.
Right. So there are some interesting tensions that are emerging in Black-Jewish relations. Again, this article didn't even touch upon them. It's totally lack context. And it's over issues like DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. All of a sudden, we're seeing this upsurge in criticism of DEI, particularly in universities. DEI, coercive DEI, and I'll call it coercive DEI versus the possibility that there could be pluralistic, inclusive DEI. Coercive DEI has already sort of contracted in the corporate space. It's still there, obviously, but it's not nearly as potent and nearly as ubiquitous as it was right after the George Floyd killing. Coercive DEI is on the ropes now, and it's amazing how quickly that's happened, which gives me hope. There was an article that was written in the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, JTA, by Andrew Silo Carroll. I didn't ask Stan to tee this up, but maybe he'll find it and be able to put a link on it, on the recent tensions around this. And you can feel how various American Jewish organizations are reverting back into sort of a pre-October 7th mindset, because as soon as they think about reorienting themselves to these new realities and saying, well, maybe DEI is creating an oppressed versus oppressor narrative that is bad for Jews and is breeding anti-Semitism, they realize that there would be a backlash from some of their traditional civil rights partners like the NAACP and the like, who have characterized all opposition to DEI, not all NAACP people, by the way, it's a diverse organization. So you see different chapters and different leaders doing different things. But, I think that probably the more majoritarian perspective is that DEI, that opposition to DEI represents a kind of racism, and they're scared that they will be branded and lumped in with the sort of Chris Rufo anti-woke school, and so therefore they snap back into their former posture of just supporting whatever woke platitudes come their way or the DEI bureaucracy, because they don't want to be lumped in that way. They're presented two options. Either you're part of the Ron DeSantis, Chris Rufo school, or you're part of the woke school, the pro-DEI bureaucracy school. And I think, and so you can see how they're being scared off any opposition or even discussion of these within the Jewish community. And I guarantee you, many of them, the people quoted in these articles, are probably hard at work trying to stifle that conversation within the Jewish community, not offer it any legitimacy that there might be problems with DEI. That so many American Jews, if you talk to them and you go and you visit them, are openly articulating right now. So what do you think about that?
I mean, I think that one of the reasons why we're seeing a little bit of the reversion as far as conversations on the different programs or ideas that are fueling anti-Semitism is because there's also a lack of will, or maybe it's a lack of know-how in explaining why those things not only are fueling anti-Semitism, but fueling a lot of things that are bad for other communities. One of the things that I've seen is a failure of not all, but many Jewish organizations to actively engage with Black community organizations and explaining, educating. Like there's a kind of one-way conversation happening. And if somebody's really an ally or a partner, the question would be, this program is fueling anti-Semitism and this is how can we do it better? And that how can we do it better isn't even being asked. Instead, it's okay, we can't even say this because we're going to be painted as all of these horrible things or bad things, and that's problematic. Because
what kind of partnership is that, by the way?
Right.
What kind of partnership requires you to say, I have to go along with this in order for you to be on good terms with me? I mean, we're saying that's not that. And look, I can understand someone saying, look, I'm pro DEI, and you're anti DEI, but I'm still willing to work with you. I may not see them as a major ally in overcoming some of the forces of liberalism in the world, but my doors are open. I mean, I'm not shutting the door on anybody.
I mean, I think that's part of it. I think the other part is that people aren't necessarily talking about the same thing when they're throwing out an acronym. When somebody says, yes, of course I'm for DEI because I'm for diversity, equality, and inclusion. Okay, what does that mean? But this is what the program is. It's not diverse. It's not equal or equitable, and it's not inclusive. Would you be for something that isn't, even if it calls itself that? And I'm sure most reasonable people would be like, of course not. Okay. And that's where you have a conversation. If people are refusing to even have the conversation or ask the questions and answer the questions, then I don't understand the purpose of the partnership other than to tokenize.
Right. I think that there's a deep psychological need of the American Jewish organizations to stand in solidarity with the historic Black civil rights organizations. I feel it, by the way. I'm just going to be honest with you, and I know some maybe more conservative supporters don't have that sense. I feel that sense of wanting and a sense of loss if there was a break in the relationship between, let's say, legacy Jewish organizations and legacy Black organizations. That would be painful for me. But at the same time, I'm not willing to say I'm going to go along with and support DEI or not oppose DEI. And I'm talking about the more applied, radical versions of DEI. Then, I'm not willing to do that and maintain a relationship, because that's not the kind of relationship I want. And that means pivoting strategically for the Jewish organization. This is what scares the bejesus out of them, because they're so bought into what they've always had. And I think that they've got to say, okay, look, this may mean that we have to reposition ourselves in the larger American society and do the hard work. Talk about hard work. We always say we got to do the hard work of whatever. Do the hard work of building a new moderate centrist coalition with other ethnic and religious communities. That's the hard work. That's the work that needs to be done in society. Yet we're stuck in this paradigm that requires us to be in alliance with people who we disagree with in a strong way on some of these issues. And I think that's misguided, and I think that should change.
Well, we're not stuck in that paradigm.
We're not stuck. No.
We're not. No, I mean, it's one of the things you learn, and the first things you learn in biology is evolve or die. Like there's a certain point that the refusal to recognize the current situation is making many individuals and organizations obsolete. Sometimes that's a good thing. Other times it isn't, because it's sad to see something that did so much good kind of wither away or fade away or become pretty useless. But I think that there's also, again, I mean, my position on DEI isn't strictly, it's not rigid. I think that there should be, okay, what's the goal and what's the purpose of any program, including DEI? If the goal and purpose is something that actually is rational and measurable and repeatable, then that's usually a program that you try to fix and improve. If the goal is just to virtue signal, it's a waste. Yeah. And unfortunately, that's what we're seeing. It's just virtue signaling.
Yeah, I might have said this on a previous podcast. Interrupt me if I did, but I noted the very compelling opinion piece written by Danielle Allen, a political philosopher at Harvard, about her experience in 2018 with DEI at Harvard. They were trying to get a pluralistic, inclusive, viewpoint diverse, respecting form of DEI through Harvard, and it got completely undermined by sort of the post George Floyd version of DEI, and Ibram X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo versions of DEI that took their place. And it was kind of tragic. And by the way, I've heard that she was a competitor with Claudine Gay at Harvard, who had obviously embraced a much more hard-edged radical version of DEI. And so I personally, while I'm I would end DEI in places we can, not because I don't think that there's a version of DEI that can do some good, but because I worry that the bureaucracies that are entrenched in DEI and at universities are going to be impossible to reform very often. That said, I would love to see some universities experiment with radical divergence in DEI and inclusive DEI and pluralistic DEI. I'm just not sure it can be done with the same personnel that they hired to do the former model. And so if they say, okay, if we're going to change, this is University of Michigan just came out with this statement from its board of trustees that they're stopping cancel culture at the University of Michigan, and we're going to support free speech. And they have the largest DEI program. I think it's a $30 million a year program at University of Michigan. Imagine that, a $30 million a year bureaucracy devoted to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'm telling you, it's not the Danielle Allen version of that. And how are they ever going to make those objectives real that they enunciated just, I think, yesterday, if they have a bureaucracy that's devoted to something completely different? So I think you'd have to end the bureaucracy before you could get a new form of cooperative DEI.
I agree. And I think that kind of goes to show that even if it were a DEI that's more acceptable, in my opinion, ideologically, it still shouldn't be all powerful.
Yes.
The issue is and with all of that money per year, like how many scholarships could that fund? What type of research lab could that fund? And instead it's forming these committees that are all powerful in these institutions.
Right.
But I mean, I think we're seeing corporations walk away from them because they're not effective.
Right. Yeah, I was looking at the description of, and I might have this wrong, the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education, something like that. And they aspire to dominate the curriculum in these universities. It's not just about making sure that there's representation of minorities in various jobs or more inclusive cultures. They want to control the curriculum, what's taught, what ideas are discussed, and what ideas are not discussed.
And I mean, in political science, we call that authoritarianism.
Yes. Yes, exactly. What do you call it in social work? Do you have a term for that?
I know, abuse.
Abuse. Yes. I always love when Brandon brings in her social work
control wheel that we could, really go into here.
Ooh,
maybe at that time.
I'm loving it. All right. Well, listen, I think we've talked enough about for the day this the old paradigm of Black-Jewish relations and this ridiculous version set out in the New York Times piece of this supposed new paradigm. And we're going to spend some time over the next year, I promise you, maybe not in the next month, but because we have some other things on the agenda, but fleshing out a true new paradigm of Black-Jewish relations, what it could look like, what it could be like. And who knows, maybe Brandy and I will even write a book someday together. We've been talking about it.
Yeah, that sounds great.
All right. Shabbat shalom, everybody.
Shabbat shalom.